Hello and welcome. If you'd like to learn more, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll explore the captivating history of Spain. The story of Spain begins long before it was Spain. The Iberian Peninsula, occupying the southwest corner of Europe, is geographically bounded by the Pyrenees, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, and the narrow Strait of Gibraltar. Its landscapes, from sun-baked plains to high mountain ranges, have always formed a natural crossroads between Africa, Europe, and the wider Mediterranean world. For millennia, diverse peoples have arrived here, leaving marks that would shape the peninsula's cultural mosaic. Paleolithic humans arrived in Iberia tens of thousands of years ago, with cave paintings at Altamira and other sites testifying to a deep artistic legacy. By the dawn of recorded history, the land was home to a patchwork of communities. The Iberians in the east and south, the Celts in the north and west, and intermingling groups throughout. Trade routes tied these peoples to the wider Mediterranean. Phoenician merchants founded colonies like Gadir, modern Cadiz, around 1100 BCE, followed by Greeks and Carthaginians. Each left a mark, introducing new crops, technologies, and ideas. 2. Roman Hispania. The true transformation began in the 3rd century BCE, when Rome and Carthage clashed in the Punic Wars. In defeating their Carthaginian rivals, the Romans launched a 2-century campaign of conquest, ultimately bringing the entire Iberian Peninsula under imperial rule. Roman Hispania, as it was now called, became one of the most important provinces in the empire. Romanization was a profound process. Latin replaced native tongues and became the ancestor of Spanish, Portuguese, and Catalan. Cities were founded or expanded: Emerita Augusta, Merida; Hispalis, Seville; Tarraco, Tarragona. With forums, theaters, temples, and aqueducts that are visible to this day. Roman law, infrastructure, and municipal organization set the foundation for later societies. Over the centuries, Hispania produced emperors such as Trajan and Hadrian, and was integrated into imperial commerce, culture, and even religion after the spread of Christianity. Yet this unity was disrupted by the gradual weakening of Roman authority from the 3rd century onwards. Barbarian invasions, Vandals, Sueves, and Alans, and ultimately the Visigoths, brought an era of instability and change. 3rd, Visigothic and early Christian Spain. By the early 5th century CE, the Visigoths, a Germanic people who had once served as federates of Rome, established a kingdom centered at Toledo. Their rule lasted for 3 centuries. The Visigothic legacy was complex. Their elites converted from Arian Christianity to Catholicism, fostering ties with the local Roman Hispanic population. They formalized codes of law, promoted church councils, and presided over a society blending Roman, Germanic, and Christian elements. However, the Visigothic monarchy, plagued by factional disputes and struggles over succession, was chronically unstable. By the early 8th century, this fragile kingdom faced a new and dramatic challenge from across the Strait of Gibraltar. The Islamic conquest and Al-Andalus. In 711 CE, Muslim armies from North Africa, led by the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad, crossed into Iberia. According to tradition, their successful invasion was aided by internal Visigothic dissent. The armies of Islam swept quickly across most of the peninsula, defeating the last Visigothic king and establishing the province of Al-Andalus as part of the expanding Umayyad Caliphate. For centuries, Al-Andalus became one of the richest, most sophisticated societies in the world. Its cities, Córdoba, Seville, Granada, Toledo, were centers of learning, industry, and religious tolerance within the social hierarchies of the time. Under the Umayyad Emirate and later the independent Caliphate of Cordoba, established in 929, Muslims, Jews, and Christians often lived in close proximity, sharing in the remarkable intellectual prowess of the region. Advances in science, philosophy, medicine, and architecture flourished. Cordoba's great mosque, libraries, and gardens astonished visitors from a then backward Christian Europe. Yet Al-Andalus was rarely monolithic or totally peaceful. Power waxed and waned between dynasties and local strongmen. Eventually, the caliphate fragmented into smaller Taifa kingdoms, inviting both internal rivalries and external threats. Fifth, the rise of Christian kingdoms. Even at the height of Muslim dominance, small Christian enclaves survived in the mountains of the north. The Kingdom of Asturias, founded by the legendary Pelayo after victory at the Battle of Covadonga, 722, marked the symbolic beginning of Christian resistance, later mythologized as the Reconquista. Over centuries, this resistance evolved into a gradual, often sporadic, Christian push southward. New kingdoms emerged: Leon, Castile, Navarre, Aragon, and later Portugal. Sometimes Christian rulers fought Muslim neighbors. At other times, they allied with them against rival Christian lords. The frontier was a site of raids, cultures, and exchanges. Castles dotted the landscape, giving Castile its name, Land of Castles. And Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities often coexisted in uneasy interdependence. As the centuries advanced, Christian military fortunes improved, particularly with the capture of Toledo in 1085. This ancient city became a powerful symbol of restoration, its libraries and scholars instrumental in transmitting classical and Arabic knowledge to the rest of Europe. 6. Medieval society and diversity. Medieval Iberia was a patchwork of cultures, languages, and faiths. Christians, Jews, and Muslims lived side by side, especially in the great urban centers. Jewish communities occupied an indispensable role as translators, merchants, scholars, and physicians. While Muslims in Christian territory, Mudajar, retained certain legal protections, yet periods of tolerance alternated with persecution, especially as Christian kings grew more powerful and religious fervor mounted. Throughout the peninsula, the mixing of traditions produced some of medieval Europe's most original art, poetry, and philosophy. The path to unification. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, Christian advances accelerated. Castile and Aragon emerged as the most important kingdoms. Each had distinct identities. Castile, rich, populous, and expansionist, became associated with the ideals of chivalry and monarchical power, while Aragon developed a commercial and maritime outlook, its influence reaching the Mediterranean, from Sicily to Sardinia, and even Athens. Meanwhile, the Nasrid kingdom of Granada, small but wealthy, survived as the last Muslim realm in Iberia, paying tribute and engaging in diplomacy to maintain its autonomy. The union that would ultimately forge Spain began in 1469 with the marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. This dynastic alliance brought together the two largest Iberian crowns, each with its own laws, institutions, and languages. Though formal political unification would take centuries, this marriage initiated a new era of coordinated policy, military cooperation, and religious ambition. Ferdinand and Isabella, known to history as the Catholic monarchs, set their sights on finishing the Christian reconquest and strengthening royal authority. They implemented reforms to tame the nobility, enhance the power of the cities loyal to the crown, and centralize administration. With their support, inquisitions were launched to enforce religious orthodoxy, a foreshadowing of later events that would fundamentally change Spanish society. The scene set for empire. By the late 15th century, the patchwork of Iberian realms had been consolidated into two powerful monarchies, united in vision, if not yet in law. The stage was set for momentous change. In 1492, three momentous events would collide. The final conquest of Granada, ending nearly 8 centuries of Muslim rule. The expulsion or forced conversion of Jews, and the successful voyage of Christopher Columbus, opening Spain's gaze toward the wider world. The world had entered the Age of Spain. The union of Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile in 1469 was a turning point, not only for the Iberian Peninsula, but for world history. Both monarchs were shrewd, relentless, and visionary. Together, their combined political and economic resources surpassed any individual kingdom's reach. From the outset, they faced formidable obstacles. Castile, by far the larger and wealthier of the two crowns, was riven by internal divisions and noble rivalries. Aragon, though less populous, was a sophisticated Mediterranean power, with major holdings in Italy and a unique tradition of regional rights and privileges. The marriage drew suspicion, even opposition, from rivals at home and abroad, but the two rulers quickly forged a partnership based on shared ambition, unifying their realms not through fusion, but through dual leadership. Despite ruling jointly, Castile and Aragon retained their own laws, parliaments, the Cortes, and fiscal systems. This arrangement would shape Spanish governance for centuries. Even so, the Catholic monarchs worked ceaselessly to impose stability and central authority. 2. Completing the Reconquista, the conquest of Granada. For centuries, Christian monarchs had dreamed of pushing Muslim power entirely from the peninsula. By the late 15th century, only Granada, the last Nasrid kingdom, remained as a symbol of Islamic endurance in the south. Wealthy and cosmopolitan, Granada had survived through a combination of tribute payments, diplomatic skill, and internal stability. Isabella and Ferdinand possessed both the means and the motivation to finish the job their ancestors had pursued for generations. Their campaign against Granada, which began in 1482, was both a military and ideological crusade, fueled by a growing narrative of religious destiny and Christian unity. The 10-year campaign was marked by sieges, small battles, and the gradual reduction of Nasrid outposts. The Catholic monarchs mobilized modern artillery, professionalized their army, and leveraged Castilian resources for the relentless offensive. In January 1492, after months of siege, the city of Granada surrendered. Boabdil, its last Muslim ruler, handed over the keys to the fabled Alhambra Palace and then entered exile. Granada's fall was celebrated across Christendom as a triumph of the faith and the restoration of Christian rule. It marked both the end of the Reconquista, a centuries-old endeavor, and the beginning of a new, more aggressive religious and political policy. Third, religious unification. The Inquisition and expulsion's victory in Granada was followed by an aggressive program of religious purification. The Catholic monarchs saw themselves as champions of holy unity. In their vision, a single faith would secure the state's strength and God's favor. Just months after the conquest of Granada, they issued the Alhambra Decree, expelling all Jews who refused conversion to Christianity. Spain's Jewish communities, which had flourished under both Muslim and Christian rule, included scholars, financiers, artisans, and physicians, many of whom had risen to prominence in royal service. Their forced departure or coerced conversion was a grave economic and cultural loss. Many left for Portugal, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and other havens, carrying with them their language and traditions. The Sephardic diaspora, those who converted, the conversos, remained, but were viewed with suspicion. At the same time, the monarchy intensified its use of the Spanish Inquisition. Established in 1478, the Inquisition operated as a royal institution with authority to investigate and punish heresy, apostasy, and secret adherence to Judaism or Islam among newly converted Christians. Its reach was wide. Its methods, including interrogation, confiscation, and public spectacle, rooted terror and conformity. Over the coming centuries, the Inquisition became a powerful tool for enforcing religious and social unity, though at the cost of intellectual freedom and cultural pluralism. Later, similar policies would target Spain's Muslim population, the Moriscos, especially in Granada, culminating in waves of deportation and violence throughout the 16th century. The Columbus enterprise and the Age of Discovery, 1492, was not only the year of Granada's fall and the expulsion of Jews, but also the year a Genoese mariner named Christopher Columbus convinced Isabella and Ferdinand to fund his daring proposal to reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic. Columbus's motives were complex, a mixture of personal ambition, religious zeal, and anticipation of trade profits. The monarchs themselves had strategic reasons. A westward route promised to outflank Portuguese power, spread Christianity, and perhaps establish a new source of wealth. After years of negotiation, they granted Columbus permission. He set sail in August 1492 aboard the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. In October, he made landfall not in Asia, but in the Bahamas, thus discovering lands previously unknown to Europeans. Over the next decades, repeated voyages revealed the extent and diversity of the New World, while failing to fulfill the fantasy of a Western passage to China or India. The impact was momentous. Columbus's discoveries not only initiated the Spanish colonization of the Americas, but permanently altered the course of world history. New trade routes, new commodities, and new diseases tied Europe, Africa, and the Americas into a single commercial and cultural system. V. Foundations of Empire, Papal Bulls and Treaties. The discovery of the Americas posed urgent new questions. Who owned these lands? What legal and religious authority would Spain assert over them? Ferdinand and Isabella turned to the papacy. The result was a series of papal bulls, notably Inter Caetera in 1493, granting Spain rights to lands discovered and to be discovered west of a designated meridian. Rival Portuguese ambitions led to the Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494, which divided the New World between the two powers. Unbeknownst to both, this arbitrarily drawn line would allocate much of Brazil to Portugal and vast swathes of the Americas to Spain. This arrangement justified the Spanish crown's sweeping claims in the Americas, claims soon enforced by soldiers, settlers, and missionaries. Early imperial ventures, the Caribbean Laboratory. Before the conquest of mainland America, Spanish explorers and colonizers focused on the Caribbean islands. Columbus's first settlement on Hispaniola, now split between Haiti and the Dominican Republic, became the base for further expansion. Soon, Spanish colonists parceled out land and indigenous labor under a system known as the encomienda, promising protection and Christianization for tribute and forced service. the consequences were devastating. Epidemic disease smallpox, measles, influenza decimated the native population, whose numbers in the Caribbean plummeted within a generation. Harsh labor, violence, and social collapse accelerated the catastrophe. Observers such as Bartolomé de las Casas, himself an encomendero turned priest, denounced the mistreatment of the indigenous people, igniting early debates over the morality of colonization. Despite these horrors, the Spanish Caribbean colonies became the testing ground for administrative systems, religious policies, and settlement patterns. La Isabela, named for the Queen, failed early on, but towns such as Santo Domingo became enduring centers of Spanish rule. 7. The deaths of the Catholic monarchs and the transition Isabella the Firm died in 1504, leaving a powerful, centralized, and expansive monarchy to her successor, her daughter Joanna. But Joanna, later known as the Mad, La Loca, would not actually rule. Her mental instability and political inexperience led Ferdinand to act as regent, and upon his own death in 1516, to the accession of their grandson, Charles of Habsburg. Charles inherited not only Castile and Aragon, but through his father, Philip the Handsome, the rich Burgundian lands of the Low Countries, and claims to the Holy Roman Empire. The stage was set for the transformation of Spain from a powerful kingdom into the hub of a truly global empire that would dominate European and world affairs for the next century. Certainly, below is Part 3 of your 10-part history of Spain. Approximately 2,000 words covering the rise of Habsburg Spain, the conquests of the American mainland, and the establishment of a world empire. The accession of Charles of Habsburg marked a new epoch in European history. Born in Ghent in 1500, Charles was the grandson of both Ferdinand and Isabella, on his mother's side, and of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I on his father's. Through inheritance, marriage, and extraordinary dynastic fortune, this single young man came into possession of an empire stretching from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, from Castile to Naples, and by 1519, from Spain's American possessions to the German heartland of Europe. Crowned Charles the Xavier of Spain, and later Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, he was the first monarch to rule Castile and Aragon as a single unit, and the first to wield truly global power. No ruler before him, and almost none after, would preside over such far-flung territories. But Charles's reign was fraught with challenge. In Spain, many resented his foreign birth and his reliance on northern advisors. The Comuneros' revolt of 1520, a rising of Castilian cities against real and perceived injustices, showed how difficult it was to weld Spain into a modern, unified state. Charles ultimately crushed the rebellion, but its memory would shape attitudes to royal power and Spanish identity for generations. Even as he confronted domestic rebellions and navigated the intricate webs of European politics, Charles's reign coincided with the explosive expansion of the Spanish Empire in the Americas, a process that would fundamentally transform Europe and the world. 2. The conquest of Mexico. By the 1510s, Spanish ventures in the Caribbean had run into diminishing returns. The indigenous labor force had collapsed, gold remained scarce, and colonists grew restless. Rumors spread of vast, wealthy empires on the mainland to the west. In 1519, Hernán Cortés, a minor nobleman and experienced soldier based in Cuba, launched an unauthorized expedition to the coast of what is now Mexico. What began as a gamble would become one of history's most fateful encounters. Cortés landed near present-day Veracruz with a small force fewer than 600 men, some cavalry, a score of firearms, and a few cannons. He quickly realized that his greatest asset was not European technology alone, but the deep resentments among the indigenous peoples subjugated by the powerful Aztec Empire, centered on the capital of Tenochtitlan, in the heart of the Valley of Mexico. Cortés forged alliances with discontented groups, notably the Tlaxcalans, and relied on translators, most famously Malintzin, or La Malinche, a gifted indigenous woman who became his advisor, interpreter, and intermediary. After a dangerous winding march inland, the Spanish were welcomed into Tenochtitlan by the Emperor Moctezuma II in November 1519. Relations quickly soured. Cortés took the emperor prisoner, violence ensued, and in 1520, the Spanish were driven from the city in the chaotic and bloody Noche Triste, Night of Sorrows. Undeterred, Cortés regrouped, forged new alliances, and laid siege to the city. After months of brutal fighting, Tenochtitlan fell in 1521, destroyed by Spanish arms, indigenous allies, famine, and disease. The mighty Aztec Empire, the greatest civilization in Mesoamerica, was left in ruins. In its place, the Spanish founded Mexico City, capital of the new viceroyalty of New Spain. The conquest of Mexico transformed Spanish ambitions. Gold and silver from the Americas started pouring into royal treasuries, financing war, diplomacy, and further exploration. The fall of Tenochtitlan became a foundational myth of the empire, a story of triumph, faith, and providence, even as it masked the violence, betrayal, and tragedy experienced by millions. Third, the conquest of Peru. While Cortés's victory electrified Europe, similar rumors reached the Caribbean about a wealthy civilization to the south, deep in the Andes. Between 1526 and 1533, Francisco Pizarro, a distant kinsman of Cortés and veteran of previous forays, led several expeditions down the Pacific coast. Pizarro's timing was both deadly and fortuitous. The Inca Empire, the most extensive state ever to arise in pre-Columbian America, had recently been decimated by a smallpox epidemic introduced by earlier Spanish contact and torn apart by civil war between rival royal brothers Atahualpa and Huáscar. In 1532, Pizarro and fewer than 200 men approached Cajamarca, where Atahualpa, now sole emperor, awaited them. Pizarro staged a daring ambush, seizing the Inca ruler amid the confusion of a parley and massacring his retainers. Atahualpa, stunned but pragmatic, offered a spectacular ransom, a room filled with gold and twice over with silver. The Spanish accepted, then executed Atahualpa anyway. By 1533, Pizarro entered the Inca capital, Cusco. Resistance persisted for decades, often savage and desperate, but the old cosmic order had been upended. In the Andes, as in Mexico, Spanish victory rested not solely on Spanish steel, but on alliances with rivals of the Inca regime, the spread of fatal diseases, and ruthless opportunism. Lima, a new city built by Pizarro on the coast, became the capital of a new viceroyalty of Peru, from which Spain exerted power over much of South America. The mines at Potosi and elsewhere would provide the silver that sustained the Spanish Habsburgs at home and abroad. 4. The empire unfolds: conquest, colonization, and catastrophe. Within a generation, Spanish explorers, soldiers, and priests had reached almost every corner of the Americas. Expeditions crossed the Andes, ranged up the Pacific coast to California, down the Rio de la Plata system through South America's heartland, and even northwards into what is now the southwestern United States. Not every venture succeeded. Juan Ponce de Leon's search for the Fountain of Youth in Florida ended with his death. Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca's epic trek across the North American continent was a story of disaster and survival. Nor was there any immediate conquest of the immense Amazon or Patagonia. Yet by mid-century, the broad outlines of Spanish imperial dominion had been set. Spain imposed an administrative and social order on its new territories, often adapting indigenous structures where useful. Royal officials, viceroys, audiencias, high courts, corregidores, district governors, were appointed to rule cities and provinces. The crown granted lands and labor rights, encomiendas, to conquerors, who became the first Creole aristocracy and formed the backbone of colonial society. The Roman Catholic Church played an immense role. Monasteries, dioceses, and parishes multiplied, and missionaries, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, labored to convert indigenous peoples. The Spanish crown wedded its authority to Catholic orthodoxy, seeing the spread of the faith as legitimizing conquest. Yet the darkest shadow of conquest was demographic collapse. Diseases to which indigenous peoples had no immunity, smallpox, typhus, measles, swept the Americas, killing millions. Estimates vary, but in some regions, populations fell by 80–90% within the first century of contact. Enforced labor, famine, warfare, and terror compounded the disaster. From this slaughter, new colonial societies arose, violent, diverse, unequal, but deeply interconnected. Fifth, the Columbian Exchange and the birth of a global economy. The Spanish Empire in the New World was not simply an extension of European society. It was the catalyst for a vast, hemispheric transformation. Crops native to the Americas, maize, potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, cacao, tobacco, were carried to Europe, Africa, and Asia, reshaping diets and economies around the globe. In return, the Spanish brought wheat, grapes, sheep, horses, cattle, and pigs to the Americas, fundamentally altering landscapes and ways of life. Entire ecologies changed. Agricultural rhythms and technologies were forever disrupted. With these changes also came new opportunities, dependencies, and forms of exploitation. Above all, silver, mostly from Potosí and Zacatecas, became the lifeblood of the Spanish world. Galleons laden with precious metals sailed annually from Veracruz and Cartagena to Havana, then on to Seville and eventually to Madrid. For a time, Spain seemed to command inexhaustible wealth, enabling Charles V to wage war against France, defend Catholicism, and realize his grand imperial ambitions. But this new Atlantic world ran on the exploitation of both indigenous peoples and, increasingly, enslaved Africans. As native populations fell, Spain began to rely on the transatlantic slave trade to fill labor shortages, especially in the Caribbean and coastal mainland plantations. The traffic in sugar, silver, tobacco, and slaves laid the foundations of the early modern global economy, an economy as brutal as it was lucrative. Spain and the wider world. While Spain's American empire boomed, trouble was never far away. Charles V, as Holy Roman Emperor, became embroiled in religious wars with Protestant German princes, ongoing rivalry with France under Francis I, and the growing maritime threats from England and the Ottoman Empire. Maintaining authority in such a conglomerate realm placed strains both on the Spanish crown's finances and its system of government. Meanwhile, the empire's reach extended even further. Spanish and Portuguese explorers, sometimes rivals, sometimes uneasy partners, as in the Treaty of Tordesillas, pushed into Asia. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan, sailing for the Spanish crown, completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. Though Magellan himself died in the Philippines, the voyage confirmed both the immensity and the unity of the world now, for the first time, connected by European shipping and commerce. Spain soon established a significant presence in the Philippines, and via its American colonies, linked Asia, the Americas, and Europe in a global circuit of goods and cultures. The Manila galleons, sailing annually between Manila and Acapulco, carried porcelain, silk, and spices from China and Japan to New Spain, and then via the fleets to Seville, onto the courts of Europe. 7. Governance, reform, and resistance. As the Spanish crown tried to oversee its far-flung dominions, new systems of government emerged. The Council of the Indies, based in Seville and later Madrid, managed colonial affairs and acted as a supreme court. Laws codified everything from urban planning, hence the grid layout still visible in Latin American cities, to the rights, often theoretical, of indigenous subjects. Indigenous elites were often incorporated into colonial rule as local governors or intermediaries. Yet, even so, colonial society was deeply hierarchical. At the top, peninsulares, born in Spain, then criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas, mestizos, mixed ancestry, and countless other castas. Africans and indigenous peoples were at the bottom. Even as Spanish law professed the rights of its new subjects, abuses and rebellions were frequent. Bartolomé de las Casas, the protector of the Indians, denounced the horrors in countless petitions and books. His campaigns led to the new laws of 1542, which aimed to limit the worst abuses of encomienda and end hereditary grants. But enforcement was sporadic, and colonial elites resisted fiercely. Resistance took many forms: indigenous uprisings, the flight to unconquered frontiers, syncretic religions, and maroon communities of runaway slaves in the forests and mountains. The Spanish Empire, even in its golden age, was never simply a story of uninterrupted power. The legacy of conquest. By the time Charles V abdicated in 1556, leaving his Spanish realms to his son Philip II and his Central European holdings to his brother Ferdinand, the Spanish world was at its greatest territorial extent. But the seeds of future crisis, financial, social, and political, had already been sown. Still, the first half of the 16th century remained the age of triumph, a time when the empire on which the sun never set appeared, however briefly, to dominate the earth's affairs. And everywhere from the mountains of Peru to the court at Madrid, from jungles of the Philippines to the cold banks of the Tagus, Spaniards and their subjects, noble and humble, indigenous and immigrant, lived in a world suddenly, breathtakingly, and dangerously transformed. History of Spain, Part 4. The Zenith of Empire, Philip II, Golden Age, and the Road to Crisis, 1556-1600. The reign of Philip II, the center of a global empire. In 1556, after decades of rule, Charles V abdicated his Spanish throne to his son, Philip II. Unlike his father, who traveled constantly to hold his domains together, Philip was resolutely Spanish. He established the administrative center of the empire in Castile and rarely ventured beyond the boundaries of his inherited kingdoms. Known as the prudent king, Philip II was a meticulous, pious, and sometimes obstinate ruler who presided over what is often considered the height of Spanish political power and territorial expansion. Philip's empire included much of Italy, the Netherlands, large swaths of the Americas, the Philippines, and even after 1580 Portugal and its immense overseas territories. For a brief period, the entire Iberian Peninsula and a third of the globe were united under one crown. From his monumental palace monastery of El Escorial, Philip sought to govern the complex, multi-ethnic, and multi-confessional lands with a combination of centralized administration, religious orthodoxy, and formidable military might. too, challenges from within and without. Yet this golden era of Spanish hegemony was shadowed by dangers both internal and external. The latter half of the 16th century was marked by almost unceasing conflict. In the Netherlands, Protestant revolt against Spanish Catholic rule triggered the 80 Years' War, a brutal, costly, and ultimately unsuccessful effort to maintain dominance over the wealthy cosmopolitan Low Countries. The Dutch proclaimed independence, founding a mercantile republic that soon became one of Spain's principal maritime rivals. In the Mediterranean, conflict with the Ottoman Turks loomed large. Philip supported Christian naval alliances, culminating in the celebrated victory at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. This battle, commanded in part by Don Juan of Austria, Philip's half-brother, ended the myth of Ottoman naval invincibility and gave Catholic Europe a much-needed symbol of triumph. Yet, Ottoman power remained an ever-present threat, forcing Spain to maintain garrisons in North Africa and defend Sicily and Naples. In the West, friction with France and especially England intensified. English privateers attacked Spanish shipping in the Atlantic. Protestant sea dogs, such as Francis Drake, became household names for their daring exploits against Spain's treasure fleets. Tensions exploded in 1588 with the ill-fated Spanish Armada, a massive fleet sent by Philip in hopes of invading England and toppling Queen Elizabeth III. The Armada's defeat was not only a devastating blow to Spanish pride and finances, but also a sign that Spain's seemingly unbeatable dominance had its limits. Third, Spain and Portugal, the Union of Crowns. In 1580, with the death of the childless King Henry, the Portuguese throne passed to Philip II, who claimed the crown through his mother. This dynastic union, which lasted until 1640, meant that the empires of Spain and Portugal, rivals for over a century, were now jointly ruled. For Spain, this brought Brazil, West Africa, parts of India, and even far-flung outposts in the East Indies within the sphere of Madrid's administration. Yet the union was uneasy. Portuguese resistance simmered below the surface, and Spain struggled to defend Portuguese interests from Dutch and English rivals in the Indian Ocean and Atlantic. The Union also further stretched Spanish resources, as defending such vast coastlines and trade networks required funds and manpower that even the silver mines of the Andes could not always supply. Wealth and its discontents, the silver tsunami. The Spanish state, perhaps more than any other in history, was fueled by global flows of precious metals. Silver from Potosí in Bolivia and Zacatecas in Mexico was shipped annually in immense fleets to Seville via Caribbean ports such as Havana and Veracruz. Much of this silver immediately left Spain again to pay for armies in Flanders, goldsmiths in Florence, silk in China, or bankers in Genoa. This constant flow had a paradoxical effect. Short term, it made Spain the richest kingdom in Europe, bankrolling art, architecture, and military conquest. Long term, it fueled unprecedented inflation. Prices for food, clothing, and land soared in Castile, impoverishing large segments of the population. Over decades, entire regions were depopulated as men sought fortune in America, or as small farmers were ruined by high taxes and rising rents. Moreover, the apparent sufficiency of silver discouraged investment in manufacturing or agriculture. Spain relied heavily on imports for essential goods. While towns like Seville thrived on trade, Castile's countryside suffered mobilization for war and mounting fiscal pressure. Spanish monarchs declared bankruptcy multiple times. much to the embarrassment and frustration of foreign creditors. 5. Empire, faith, and the Inquisition. If expansion and military glory were one pillar of the Spanish monarchy, uncompromising Catholic faith was another. Philip II saw himself as the champion of Christendom. He waged wars against Protestant rebels in the Netherlands, supported the Catholic League in France's wars of religion, and led repeated campaigns against the Ottomans. At home, Philip's religious policy was equally rigid. He enforced orthodoxy, expelled or converted religious minorities, and subjected the Spanish Church to royal direction. The Inquisition, founded in the previous century, reached new heights of influence. Not merely a tool for detecting heresy, the Inquisition regulated books, policed morals, and infiltrated every corner of civic life. Conversos, Jews or Muslims who had converted, sometimes involuntarily, to Christianity, were under constant suspicion. Moriscos, Muslim converts and their descendants, faced discrimination and ultimately expulsion. Despite its reputation for severity, the Inquisition was as much an instrument of social control as of theology. Its archives are filled with cases about magic, gossip, blasphemy, and forbidden books. This climate fostered conformity, but stifled certain kinds of innovation and dissent, leaving a complex legacy. 6. The Spanish Golden Age, culture and contradiction. Ironically, this period of tension and crisis was also the moment of Spain's greatest artistic and literary flowering. The so-called Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Golden Age, extends from the late 16th into the early 17th century. It produced giants whose works are still studied and celebrated worldwide. Miguel de Cervantes penned Don Quixote, a masterstroke that both mocked and ennobled the ideals of chivalry and Spanish identity. The novel's wit, insight, and humanity made it the prototype of the modern European novel. Playwrights like Lope de Vega and Calderón de la Barca created a vibrant national theater, mixing tragedy and comedy with explorations of power, honor, and the nature of reality. Painting flourished as well. El Greco, foreign-born but thoroughly Spanish in his vision, painted canvases thick with supernatural intensity. Later, Diego Velázquez, court painter to Philip IV, would become one of the greatest portraitists in history. Architecture, too, reached new heights. El Escorial embodies the austere grandeur and self-certainty of the Spanish monarchy. This explosion of creativity reflected a society at the burning heart of early modern global exchange. Spain was both intensely proud, Catholic, and hierarchical, and yet in constant conversation with Italy, Flanders, the Americas, and even Asia. BM 7. Crisis on the horizon. Yet the seeds of later catastrophe were already visible. War, inflation, depopulation, and social rigidity took their toll. In the countryside, peasants faced burdensome taxation. In the cities, artisans and laborers struggled as wealth flowed toward nobles and court favorites. The rigid division between nobility of blood and commoners, magnified by the obsession with limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, created a social system with little flexibility or upward mobility. By the end of the 16th century, the population of Castile, despite all the gold and glory, was smaller, poorer, and more embattled than a century before. The monarchy found itself overextended and mired in wars it could not decisively win. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the world, rivals gained strength. Dutch and English ships challenged Spanish rule in the Caribbean and the East Indies. France recovered from civil strife to reassert itself as an equal on the European continent. Even within Spain, regions like Catalonia chafed at Castilian dominance and heavy-handed taxation. 8. A new century awaits. As the 16th century ended, Spain remained the world's preeminent power, but also one battered by war, rising debt, and deep social tensions. Philip II died in 1598, leaving the throne to his son, Philip III. The 17th century would bring new challenges: court intrigue, rebellion, and ultimately, the gradual erosion of Spain's primacy on the world stage. Yet, the era of Habsburg glory had left an indelible mark, not just in palaces, paintings, and cathedrals, but in the interconnected world Spain had helped create, a world forever changed by Iberian ambition. History of Spain, Part 5. 17th century decline, crisis, war, and the end of Habsburg rule, 1600 and 1714. A new century of anxiety. At the turn of the 17th century, the Spanish monarchy showed all the trappings of greatness. Gold and silver still flowed from the Americas. Courtly splendor abounded in Madrid and in the villas of the powerful. And the crown ruled over a mosaic of kingdoms from Italy to Flanders, and overseas to the New World and Asia. Yet beneath the glittering facade, deep political, social, and economic malaise had set in. The reigns of Philip III, 1598 to 1621, Philip IV, 1621-1665, and Charles II, 1665 to 1700, were characterized less by expansion than by a slow unraveling of imperial strength. Spain, which for a century had held the initiative in European affairs, now found itself on the defensive, battered by crises from within and without. Population, economy, and society in decline. Several factors converged to create the so-called 17th century crisis. First, massive expenditure on war and bureaucracy, funded by American silver, led to repeated royal bankruptcies in 1607, 1627, and 1647. The costs of keeping troops in Flanders, Italy, and the Mediterranean, coupled with the need to defend far-flung colonial possessions and maintain a global navy, drained the crown's resources. Second, inflation devastated Castile's agrarian economy. Silver imports raised prices without fostering domestic manufacturing or agricultural improvements. Rural depopulation occurred as small farmers and workers migrated to the Americas, sought refuge in towns, or fell into poverty. Even as noble estates grew larger, productive land was often left fallow. Feudal privileges and tax exemptions stunted economic innovation. Social rigidity deepened, while Castile's nobility became fixated on maintaining limpieza de sangre, purity of blood, and exempting themselves from labor and taxes. The crown increasingly squeezed the remaining population for revenue. Epidemics and poor harvests caused famine and demographic decline. A series of plague outbreaks further reduced the population by hundreds of thousands, emptying villages and weakening Spain's ability to recover from war. Third, war without end. The decline was accelerated by near constant warfare. The first half of the century was consumed by the later stages of the 80 Years' War in the Netherlands. Despite pouring men and money into Flanders, Spanish forces were unable to stem the tide of Dutch independence. The 12 Years' Truce, 1609-1621, gave Spain a respite, but war resumed until the 1648 Treaty of Westphalia recognized Dutch sovereignty and symbolized the end of Spain's golden age of imperial dominance in Northern Europe. The 30 Years' War, 1618-1648, the greatest conflict of early modern Europe, drew Spain in alongside Catholic Habsburg Austria against Protestant states and France. Although Spanish armies initially won significant battles, the cost was enormous. The Battle of Rocroi in 1643 delivered a shocking defeat to Spain at the hands of the French, signaling the rise of France and the eclipse of Spanish land power in Europe. Conflict erupted at home as well. Portugal, chafing under the so-called Iberian Union, revolted in 1640 and restored independence by 1668. Catalonia also rose in revolt in the Reapers' War of 1640-1652, protesting the burdens of war taxation and Castilian centralization. Naples, Sicily, and Aragon faced their own uprisings, often driven by popular dissatisfaction rather than regional nationalism alone. The crisis of monarchy and the end of the Habsburgs. As the decades wore on, political paralysis at the royal court deepened. Weak and often childlike monarchs, especially Philip IV and Charles II, devolved power to favorites, validos, influential courtiers who presided over intricate webs of patronage, intrigue, and corruption. The most famous of these was the Count Duke of Olivares, whose ambitious reforms failed to overcome entrenched privilege or reverse decline. Charles II's reign, 1665 and 1700, was the culmination of crisis. Plagued by physical and mental disabilities, the result of generations of intermarriage among the Habsburgs, Charles proved unable to produce an heir. His court became the arena for international intrigue, as France and Austria plotted to divide Spain's inheritance. At his death, the Spanish crown was bankrupt. The population had declined by over 1 million since the previous century, and many regions seethed with resentment and hardship. Society, culture, and everyday life. Despite decline and hardship, the 17th century also witnessed expressions of astonishing cultural vitality, a paradox at the heart of Spanish life. This was the era of Spain's great dramatists, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, Tirso de Molina, the mature works of Diego Velázquez, Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, and Francisco de Zurbarán, and the haunting landscapes and religious visions captured in painting and poetry. The contradictions of faith and violence, grandeur and decay, courtly excess and rural want found voice in the spectacle of Spanish Baroque culture. Society became, if anything, more hierarchical, with noble status prized above all. Hidalgos, untitled nobles, grew ever more numerous even as their fortunes faded, collecting tax exemptions and uniforms but rarely wielding substantive power. The lower classes were increasingly burdened with taxes or conscription, while the marginalized Moriscos, descendants of Muslims, Jews, former slaves faced expulsion, forced conversion, or social exclusion. The economic crisis led to ingenuity and adaptation. Smuggling, banditry, and petty commerce flourished. The Americas, despite their remoteness, offered opportunity. Criollos, American-born Spaniards, mestizos, indigenous peoples, and Africans created vibrant, sometimes rebellious, colonial societies. Spanish became the language of daily life across the Americas, but local cultures persisted alongside Iberian customs. 6. The War of the Spanish Succession, 1701-1714. The death of Charles II without an heir created the first great international crisis of the 18th century. The issue of who would inherit Spain and its empire plunged Europe into conflict, the War of the Spanish Succession. Competing factions backed either Philip of Anjou, grandson of France's Louis XIV, representing the Bourbon dynasty, or Archduke Charles of Austria, of the Habsburg line. The war raged across Europe and the Atlantic world. Battles took place in Italy, the Netherlands, the Mediterranean, North America, and in Spain, between Castilian supporters of the Bourbons and Catalans, Valencians and Aragonese who feared loss of their regional privileges and supported the Habsburgs. The siege of Barcelona in 1714 brought a final bitter end to Catalan resistance. The Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, and Rastatt, 1714, redrew the map of Europe. Philip V remained King of Spain, but renounced his claim to the French throne, ensuring that Spain and France would never be united. Spain lost most of its European possessions. The Spanish Netherlands went to Austria, Gibraltar, and Minorca to Britain, while Naples, Milan, and Sardinia were removed from direct Spanish control. But the American and Philippine colonies remained firmly Spanish. The long Bourbon dynasty now took the throne. The nation had survived its greatest trial, emerging battered but intact, ready for a new era of reform, enlightenment, and, ultimately, crisis. Bourbon Spain, Enlightenment reforms, and the making of the modern state, 1714-1808. The Bourbon dynasty ascends. With the end of the War of the Spanish Succession, the Bourbon dynasty began its long tenure on the Spanish throne. Philip V, grandson of France's Louis XIV, introduced a new era and set about reshaping Spanish rule both at home and abroad. While Spain's territory in Europe had been reduced, the empire across the Atlantic and Pacific remained intact, and the core Spanish kingdoms themselves now underwent significant changes. The Bourbon monarchs sought to centralize authority, streamline administration, and revitalize the long-declining empire. Inspired in many ways by Enlightenment ideas and by the more modernized French state, the Bourbons were ambitious reformers, but also absolute rulers. Their policies would have profound, often contradictory effects, modernizing Spain while provoking new tensions across society and empire. 2. Centralization and administrative reform. One of the Bourbons' first moves was to abolish many ancient regional privileges and unify Spain under a more centralized monarchy. The Nueva Planta decrees, enacted between 1707 and 1716, did away with the independent laws and institutions of Aragon, Valencia, Catalonia, and the Balearic Islands. Castilian laws and administrative systems now became the template for all Spain, giving the monarchy greater control but stoking resentment in regions long accustomed to self-rule. To improve governance, the Crown created a series of new ministries, secretarias, that supervised finances, war, justice, and the overseas colonies. The Council of the Indies and other ancient advisory bodies retained ceremonial roles but lost much of their real power to royal ministers closely overseen by the king. The Bourbons also invested heavily in the army and navy, building modern arsenals, fortresses, and shipyards, especially in Cadiz, Cartagena, Ferrol, and Havana. The aim was not only to defend Spain and its colonies from rivals like Britain and France, but also to assert Spanish pride and independence after years of humiliation. The Bourbon reforms in the empire. Recognizing the empire's importance, enlightened ministers applied major reforms to Spain's overseas domains, particularly under Charles III in 1759-1788, the greatest of the enlightened despots. The so-called Bourbon reforms included administrative changes. The old viceroyalties of New Spain, Mexico, and Peru were joined by new ones: New Granada, Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador in 1717, and Rio de la Plata, Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia in 1776. Provincial government was restructured with the introduction of intendancies, offices filled by professional bureaucrats instead of hereditary nobles or local elites. Economic liberalization. Restrictions on trade that had favored a handful of Spanish ports were gradually eased. The comercio libre, free trade within the empire, reforms of the late 18th century stimulated transatlantic commerce, allowed new ports to flourish, and encouraged production of goods beyond silver and gold: cocoa, sugar, tobacco, wine, and textiles. Military organization. Creole militias, made up of American-born Spaniards, were expanded, improving local defense, but also providing colonists with military experience that would later fuel independence movements. Religious reforms. Seeking to reduce the enormous power of the Church, the Bourbons expelled the Jesuit order from Spain and its colonies in 1767. The Jesuits had been powerful educators, missionaries, and landowners, but their loyalty to the Pope and independence from royal control made them suspect in Enlightenment and absolutist eyes. Enlightenment in Spain. Although often overshadowed by developments in France, Britain, or Germany, the Spanish Enlightenment, Ilustración, left a profound legacy. Spanish intellectuals, scientists, and reformers embraced ideas of reason, science, utility, and progress. Salons, scientific societies, like the Royal Botanical Garden and economic societies in Madrid, newspapers, and universities became forums for new thinking. Figures such as Benito Feijó criticized superstition, promoted empirical science, and encouraged rational inquiry. Gaspar Melchor de Jovellanos advocated educational reform, agricultural modernization, and legal rationalization. Explorers and naturalists traveled the empire, cataloging plants, mapping coasts, and reporting on indigenous societies. Yet, the Enlightenment in Spain was never a pure or anti-clerical force. Many reformers remained pious Catholics and saw no contradiction between faith and reason. The state encouraged science so long as it strengthened royal authority, economic productivity, and the defense of empire. Art, architecture, and literature flourished as well. Neoclassical palaces and public buildings transformed Madrid and provincial cities. Painters like Francisco de Goya began their careers at the royal court and later became chroniclers of social unease and the horrors of war. Growing tensions and social changes. Despite its modernizing ambitions, Bourbon Spain was a society rife with inequality. In the metropolis, the nobility and clergy still commanded great privilege, while the majority laborers, artisans, and peasants bore the brunt of taxation and remained vulnerable to food shortages, disease, and economic downturns. In the colonies, social hierarchies were even more rigid. Peninsulares, Spaniards born in Spain, occupied nearly all senior administrative roles, while Creoles, American-born Spaniards, grew wealthy but politically frustrated. Below them were mestizos, indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and free people of color. Each was confined by caste laws and limited mobility, but local society was far more complex, dynamic, and restive than these hierarchies suggest. Indigenous resistance to forced labor and tribute persisted, sometimes erupting in massive uprisings. Notably, the Tupac Amaru de Secu Rebellion in Peru, 1780-1781, which sought to reclaim Inca rights and nearly overthrew Spanish power in the Andes. Smaller revolts flared up throughout the colonies and even in Spain itself, as peasants protested taxes, conscription, and the enclosure of common land. The final decades of the 18th century witnessed an uneasy blend of Enlightenment optimism and mounting anxiety about change. Kegs, reforms, reaction, and the social fabric. The reforms had unintended consequences. By appointing more professional officials, the Bourbons weakened the power of old colonial elites, sowing resentment among Creoles. By opening trade, they fostered the rise of a native-born merchant and artisan class and increased competition with Spanish manufacturers. Improvements in education and communication allowed new ideas, including the American and French revolutions, to filter into society, raising questions about liberty, rights, and the legitimacy of monarchy and empire. The privileged orders, the clergy and nobility, deeply entrenched and often resistant to reform, worked with the monarchy, but also blocked deeper structural change. The crown's desire to maintain royal authority and avoid the fate of France's Bourbon cousins in the guillotine led to both reform and repression, censorship and surveillance. 7. Spain on the eve of upheaval. By the dawn of the 19th century, Bourbon Spain stood at a crossroads. Enlightened reforms had modernized the state, expanded the economy, and unleashed new intellectual currents. Yet they had also eroded the foundations of traditional authority and stirred powerful resentments, especially among the Creole elites in America, who increasingly felt both Spanish and separate. Externally, global competition was fiercer than ever. The British, French, and Dutch outmatched Spain at sea and in commerce. The slave revolts in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, the American Revolution, and eventually the French Revolution revealed that empire and monarchy were not unassailable. Internally, decades of reform had paradoxically undermined royal authority and social consensus, planting the seeds for the coups, revolutions, and wars that would define the age to follow. It was a world poised for transformation and for crisis. A new Spain, both at home and in its empire, at the threshold of modernity and revolution. I. Europe in revolution. Spain faces the Napoleon shock. The dawn of the 19th century brought both hope and foreboding to Spain. Although a reluctant participant in the wars spawned by the French Revolution, Spain's monarchy was vulnerable from within and without. The radical ideas unleashed in France, Britain's growing naval might, and the influence of Atlantic revolutions all pressed hard against the old imperial order. King Charles IV, beset by court intrigue and widely seen as weak, ruled Spain with the aid of the controversial favorite Manuel Godoy. By 1807, Spain, nominally allied with Napoleon, had permitted French troops to cross into its territory and invade neighboring Portugal. But this cooperation was short-lived. In 1808, Napoleon exploited divisions in the Spanish court, forced both Charles IV and his son Ferdinand VII to abdicate, and installed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain. The result was national outrage. What followed was not just a change of dynasty, but a profound national trauma. The Peninsular War, resistance, and the birth of modern Spain. The French occupation touched off a spontaneous and ferocious resistance. City after city rose in revolt against the foreign king and his French-imposed reforms. Popular insurrections in Madrid and elsewhere erupted into brutal reprisals, famously immortalized by Goya's paintings of the Dos de Mayo uprising. Across the country, guerrilla warfare, small bands of irregular fighters harassing French columns, became a model of popular resistance. As the French tightened control, juntas, local autonomous councils, sprang up to coordinate opposition, failing to reimpose Bourbon order but refusing to accept Napoleonic rule. These juntas organized armies, called for a national Cortes, parliament, and oversaw the resistance alongside British and Portuguese allies, notably Arthur Wellesley, the future Duke of Wellington. The Peninsular War, 1808-1814, was devastating. Cities were shelled, fields ravaged, population decimated. Hundreds of thousands died, civilians as well as soldiers. But the war resembled not just a national liberation, but a civil conflict over Spain's future. Third, the Constitution of Cadiz and the vision of liberal Spain. In 1810, as French armies occupied much of the peninsula, representatives from cities, regions, and the overseas empire gathered in Cadiz, the only major city under Spanish control, to draft a new constitution. The result, enacted in 1812, was one of the most advanced constitutions of the era. It established national sovereignty, limited monarchy, universal male suffrage of a kind, freedom of the press, and the abolition of feudal privileges. Importantly, it claimed representation not only for peninsular Spaniards, but for their counterparts across Spanish America and the Philippines. A truly transatlantic vision that briefly transcended old hierarchies. The Constitution of Cadiz became a touchstone for liberals in Spain and Latin America for generations to come. Collapse of empire, the Latin American Wars of Independence. While Spain agonized under occupation, its vast American empire quickly unraveled. News of the king's forced abdication, the occupation of Spain, and the collapse of central authority fostered deep uncertainty. In the absence of legitimate royal authority, American-born elites and radical groups formed their own juntas, claiming to govern in the name of the captive Ferdinand VII, but increasingly acting as sovereign entities. At first, many in Spanish America hoped to preserve the monarchy, or at least negotiate for greater self-government. But conflicts between Creoles, American-born elites, and Peninsulares, Spanish-born officials, fears of popular revolution by the mixed race and indigenous masses, and the inspiring examples of Haiti and the United States hastened calls for full independence. By 1810, movements for autonomy or independence sprang up in Caracas, Buenos Aires, Bogota, and throughout Greater Mexico. The coming decade became a swirling cauldron of revolt, civil war, repression, and heroic revolutionary achievement. Key theaters of independence. South America. In the north, Simón Bolívar, the liberator, led an epic struggle across Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, defeating royalist forces and forging short-lived Gran Colombia. In the south, José de San Martín led Argentine, Chilean, and Peruvian liberation campaigns, including the celebrated crossing of the Andes. Mexico. The priest Miguel Hidalgo led the first cry of revolt, Grito de Dolores, in 1810, mobilizing peasants and indigenous communities. Though captured and executed, he inspired José María Morelos and later Vicente Guerrero, whose coalition of liberals and conservative royalists negotiated independence in 1821 in Central America and the Caribbean. Independence movements swept through Central America, though Cuba and Puerto Rico remained under Spanish rule until the end of the century. Faith, restoration, and reaction, the return of Ferdinand VII. In 1814, after Napoleon's downfall, Ferdinand VII was restored to the Spanish throne by international agreement. He immediately repudiated the liberal constitution, dissolved the Cortes, and reinstated absolute monarchy. Reaction and repression followed. Constitutionalists were executed or exiled, the Inquisition restored, and civil liberties retrenched. But the genie was out of the bottle. The loss of virtually all mainland American colonies by 1826 left Spain a diminished power. Attempts to recapture lost territories failed. The monarchy faced mounting fiscal problems, popular unrest, and divisions between liberals and conservatives. Another brief flowering of liberal revolution, the Trienio Liberal, 1820-1823, led to the re-establishment of the 1812 Constitution. But French intervention, the 100,000 Sons of St. Louis, restored Ferdinand's absolute rule, signaling the weakness of Spain internationally and its incapacity for deep reform. The social and cultural toll. The Napoleonic Wars and independence movements shattered the foundations of Spain's old order. The treasury was bankrupt, agriculture and trade devastated, and the once proud army reduced to factional gangs. Population losses and the ongoing flight of liberal educated, or entrepreneurial groups abroad stifled renewal. Yet, cultural life remained profound. Francisco de Goya, Spain's greatest artist of the age, chronicled the terror of war, the cruelty of the Inquisition, and the dark pessimism of a society in crisis. Journalism, satirical pamphlets, and clandestine societies proliferated, discussing new political theories and the ways of other nations. The new Spain was smaller and deeply unstable, but not without resilience or creative force. 7. The Prelude to a New Spain. When Ferdinand VII died in 1833, he left behind a country transformed by revolution and war. Spain's overseas empire was shattered, but the legacies of constitutionalism, liberalism, and popular struggle endured. The fight between absolutist reactionaries and liberal reformers would erupt repeatedly in the decades to come, sometimes as open civil war, sometimes as hard-fought struggle for institutions and rights. What emerged from these crises was not the imperial Spain of old, but a nation groping toward constitutional monarchy, modern bureaucracy, and integration into the wider currents of 19th century Europe. The turbulent aftermath of empire. The defeat of Napoleon and the independence of most of Spain's American colonies left the country deeply weakened and divided. Unlike Britain or France, which could draw new strength from their continuing empires, Spain entered the 19th century isolated, poorer, and without consensus about its national future. The power vacuum was soon filled not by unity, but by decades of bitter discord. 2. Dynastic crisis and the Carlist Wars. King Ferdinand VII's death in 1833 triggered an immediate succession crisis. Ferdinand, having no male heir, named his infant daughter Isabella as queen under the regency of her mother, Maria Cristina. This decision broke the traditional male line of succession and angered conservatives who backed Ferdinand's brother, Don Carlos. Thus began the Carlist Wars. First, 1833-1840. Second, 1846-1849. Third, 1872-1876, which convulsed much of Spain, especially the Basque country, Navarre, Aragon, and Catalonia. The Carlists, defenders of traditional monarchy, Catholicism, and regional fueros, local rights, fought against the Isabelline or Cristino government, which championed constitutional monarchy and centralization. The wars were brutal, marked by guerrilla tactics, reprisals, and large-scale civilian suffering. Ultimately, the Carlists failed, but their movement persisted for another century, keeping alive regional divisions and distrust of central government. Third, political instability and liberal experimentation. The period from 1833 to the end of the century featured chronic instability, frequent revolutions and pronunciamientos, coups by generals or liberal factions often supported by parts of the army-removed governments or replaced one constitution with another, swing between conservative and progressive constitutions. Between 1834 and 1876, Spain oscillated between more liberal charters, expanding the suffrage, limiting royal power, championing civil liberties, and conservative restorations. Rise of a two-party system, the moderados and progresistas, moderate and progressive liberals, enabled a kind of managed alternation in office, though real reform often stalled, and local oligarchies, caciquismo, manipulated elections. Period of the Regency. Queen Isabella II's reign, 1843-1868, was marred by palace intrigue, factionalism, and corruption. Her erratic leadership and favoritism diminished the prestige of the monarchy. In 1868, the so-called Glorious Revolution deposed Isabella II and briefly ushered in a period of experimentation, the First Spanish Republic, 1873-1874, which quickly collapsed into chaos and was ended by a restoration of the Bourbons, Alfonso X, by 1874. Socioeconomic modernization and backwardness change, nevertheless, swept through Spanish society. Abolition of feudal laws and privileges. The 1830s saw the desamortization, confiscation, and privatization of church and communal lands to raise state revenue and create a rural middle class. Yet, in practice, much went to urban or wealthy speculators and deepened rural poverty. Thus, emergence of industry. Catalonia became a textile center. The Basque provinces focused on steel and shipbuilding. Urbanization accelerated, but Spain remained largely rural and poor compared to its European neighbors. Railways, roads, and telegraphs. These connected Spain's regions, though investment lagged behind the rest of Western Europe. Modern banking and a middle class began to emerge, but most of the country remained dominated by large landowners, latifundios, or small, subsistence farmers in perpetual debt. Labor and social unrest. Discontent with extremely difficult conditions, peasants and workers embraced socialist, anarchist, or republican ideas, especially in Andalusia, Catalonia, and urban centers. Strikes, peasant protests, and underground movements marked the close of the century. 5. Culture and identity in the age of crisis. Despite turmoil, the century was rich in culture. Romanticism, realism, and modernist currents flourished in literature, music, and painting. The politics of national identity became ever more central. Basque and Catalan regionalist movements gathered strength, demanding cultural, political, and eventually linguistic autonomy within or apart from the Spanish nation-state. Art and intellectual life took new directions, contributing to what would culminate in the generation of 98 writers and thinkers who reflected on Spain's decline, soul, and prospects for regeneration. 6. The disaster of 1898, the end of overseas empire. By the end of the century, only Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a few small Pacific and African territories remained of Spain's once grand overseas empire. Cuba, in particular, was a source of both profit and discontent. Plantation wealth enriched Spanish elites, but local Creoles, free people of color, and, after abolition, the broader society, resented political repression and economic exploitation. 10 Years' War, 1868, 1878, and smaller, recurring uprisings frayed the colonial regime. In 1895, a new Cuban revolt, now openly dedicated to independence, broke out, soon matched by rebellion in the Philippines. The United States, expanding its influence in the Caribbean and the Pacific, intervened following the controversial sinking of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor. The Spanish-American War, 1898, was brief and catastrophic for Spain. U.S. forces quickly defeated an underfunded, outgunned Spanish military. Spain ceded Cuba, which became nominally independent but quickly a U.S. client, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, which after a brief and bitter Filipino revolt became an American imperial possession. The disaster of '98 was a national trauma. The end of empire forced Spain to confront its failure to modernize, its social and regional divisions, and its marginalization in European affairs. The monarchy and political elite faced a rising tide of republicanism, labor activism, and regional nationalism. Depress 7. Looking forward. Spain at a crossroads. With the loss of empire, the country turned inward. New debates about national identity, the need for reform, and possibilities for regeneration emerged. While economic growth would resume in the early 20th century, political and social tensions remained unresolved. The monarchy survived, but only barely. The sense of a nation in search of redemption would color Spanish society and politics for decades to come. The crisis of the monarchy and the rise of republicanism. After the disaster of 1898, Spain entered the 20th century as a nation caught between tradition and modernity. The monarchy under Alfonso XIII, ascended 1902, presided over an era of social unrest, labor agitation, and growing calls for reform. Despite pockets of economic modernization, especially in Catalonia and the Basque country Spain, remained riven by poverty, illiteracy, and rural backwardness. The working class and peasantry embraced socialism, anarchism, and syndicalism, organizing powerful unions such as the UGT, socialist, and CNT, anarchist. Urbanization, strikes, and political violence, most notably during Tragic Week in Barcelona, 1909, showed the monarchy's inability to adapt. Political life was marred by corruption and caciquismo, local bossism, with rigged elections, weak governments, and an aristocratic elite slow to embrace change. The military, increasingly powerful, frequently intervened to restore order, but often exacerbated tensions. 2. The dictatorship of Primo de Rivera, 1923–1930. In 1923, amidst chaos and humiliation from colonial defeat in Morocco, the Rif War, General Miguel Primo de Rivera seized power with the king's blessing. His coup established a paternalistic, technocratic dictatorship aimed at ending disorder, modernizing institutions, and protecting the monarchy. Primo de Rivera's regime invested in infrastructure, building roads, railways, and modernizing the military, but failed to resolve fundamental problems. Political parties were dissolved, censorship imposed, and both left and right-wing opposition repressed. By the decade's end, with the world sinking into the Great Depression, his popularity plummeted, resigned in 1930, leaving the monarchy even weaker. 3rd, the Second Spanish Republic, 1931–1936, hope and discord. In municipal elections of 1931, Republican and socialist candidates triumphed in major cities. King Alfonso XIII departed, and the Second Republic was proclaimed, ushering in one of Spain's most idealistic and turbulent chapters. The Republic undertook ambitious reforms: universal suffrage, including votes for women, separation of church and state, secular education, agrarian reform, aiming to break up vast, inefficient estates and empower landless peasants, autonomy statutes for Catalonia and the Basque country. Yet the Republic was deeply divided. While liberals and socialists sought steady reform, the right viewed the Republic as a threat to tradition, church, and property. The countryside saw peasant unrest and violent occupations. The military, angered by reforms and downsizing, conspired against the regime. In 1933, right-wing parties, CEDA, gained power. In 1934, the Asturias Uprising, a radical workers' revolt, was ruthlessly crushed by the army. Political polarization intensified, violence became more frequent, and trust in parliamentary democracy frayed. By 1936, the left-wing Popular Front coalition returned to government. Conspiracies multiplied, and by mid-year, a group of generals began plotting a coup. The Spanish Civil War, 1936 and 1939. On July 17 to 18, 1936, military insurgents launched a rebellion against the Republic. The putsch failed to secure immediate control, and Spain descended into 3 years of brutal civil war. The Nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco and comprising monarchists, conservatives, Falangist fascists, and large parts of the regular army, were supported by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. They promised order, religion, and the defense of Spain. The Republicans defended democracy with support from socialists, communists, anarchists, regionalists, and international volunteers, receiving limited aid from the Soviet Union and the international brigades. The Republic also attempted reform and revolution amidst war, leading to internal divisions and sometime bloody purges. Major cities, Madrid, Barcelona, endured sieges, air raids, and starvation. Franco's forces gradually advanced, committing atrocities in Badajoz, Guernica, and elsewhere. Republican reprisals and anti-church violence also left deep scars. Culture, art, poetry, and propaganda became weapons. Picasso painted Guernica, Lorca wrote against fascism, and thousands fled or died for their ideals. By early 1939, Barcelona and Madrid fell. Franco proclaimed victory. The toll, up to 1 million deaths, mass exile, ruined economy, and a polity riven by hatred and trauma. Vice, Francoist Spain, 1939 to 1975. Repression, autarky, and gradual opening. The Civil War shaped Spain for decades to follow. Franco declared a Caudillo-styled authoritarian regime. All political parties, except the official Falange, were banned. Press and unions were tightly controlled. Political opponents were imprisoned, executed, or exiled. The Catholic Church gained immense power in education, law, and society. The post-war years of hunger brought poverty, scarcity, and global isolation. Spain remained neutral in World War II, but was diplomatically shunned due to fascist sympathies and harsh repression. Autarky, economic self-sufficiency, black markets, and mass migrations from countryside to city further strained the social fabric. Only with the Cold War did Spain find new allies. The US and Western Europe gradually accepted Franco as an anti-communist bulwark, providing aid and investment. Prosperity, Spanish miracle, emerged in the 1960s, driven by industrialization, mass tourism, and urban growth. Social life modernized, but political repression persisted. In the later years, rising regional nationalist sentiments, especially in Catalonia and the Basque Country, labor unrest and clandestine pro-democracy activism grew. Franco, aging and isolated, named Juan Carlos, grandson of Alfonso XIII, as his successor in 1969, hoping to preserve his system. 6. Culture, memory, and passage to democracy. The Franco era was marked by censorship, nostalgia for empire, and reactionary values. Yet, paradoxically, modern filmmakers, Luis Buñuel, Carlos Saura, writers and artists, began probing national identity and the wounds of the past. When Franco died in November 1975, Spain was poised for change. The regime's contradictions, economic modernization, and a new generation's desire for freedom set the stage for a dramatic transformation that would finally fulfill the century's quest for renewal, democracy, and European integration. E. The transition to democracy. La transición. The death of Francisco Franco in November 1975 closed an era of dictatorship, fear, and repression. Most expected a turbulent aftermath, but Spain's transformation was remarkable in its speed and relative peace. Juan Carlos III, crowned king as Franco's chosen successor, confounded expectations. Instead of maintaining authoritarianism, he championed a constitutional monarchy. The architect of La Transición was Prime Minister Adolfo Suárez. Appointed in 1976, Suárez skillfully built consensus between reformist Francoists, the clandestine left, centrist liberals, and moderate nationalists. In 1977, Spain held its first free elections in over 40 years. The new parliament drafted a constitution, ratified in 1978, that established Spain as a parliamentary monarchy with strong protections for civil liberties, human rights, and pluralism. The constitution decentralized power, creating autonomous communities, comunidades autónomas, which gave regions such as Catalonia, the Basque Country, and Galicia unprecedented self-government over language, education, and culture, a key to national reconciliation. 2. The challenges of a new democracy. Spain's transition was not without peril. The country faced violence from the far left, Grapo, from Basque separatists, ETA, and from the extreme right, Tensions reached a crescendo on February 23, 1981, when armed civil guards led by Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero unsuccessfully stormed Parliament in a coup attempt. King Juan Carlos's defense of democracy rallied the nation and ensured the continuity of the new order. The 1982 general election brought the socialist PSOE party, led by Felipe González, to power. Under his leadership and through alternating conservative governments, Spain underwent social modernization, legalizing divorce, expanding the welfare state, improving healthcare and education, and liberalizing society. Third, European and global integration. Spain's major post-Franco accomplishment was integration into Europe and the wider world. Joining the European Economic Community, EEC, now the European Union, in 1986, Spain modernized its infrastructure, received immense investment, and tied its fate to a broader European project. The 1992 Barcelona Olympics and Expo 92 in Seville symbolized Spain's return from isolation and poverty to modern, cosmopolitan vigor. Spanish companies, architects, filmmakers, such as Pedro Almodóvar, and athletes achieved international acclaim. Migration, both internal and from Latin America, Africa, and Eastern Europe, made Spain one of Europe's most diverse societies. Spain also joined NATO and participated in European and global peacekeeping, asserting a new international role after decades of autarky and marginalization. Economic booms and busts. The Spanish miracle was echoed in the 1990s and 2000s as rapid growth, construction, tourism, and financial liberalization created jobs and fostered prosperity. Cities like Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Valencia, and Malaga were transformed by public works, museums, and booming service industries. However, the 2008 global financial crisis exposed deep vulnerabilities, over-reliance on real estate, high youth unemployment, and regional disparities. An austerity period followed, marked by Los Indignados, the outraged protests, smaller parties' rise, and distrust of traditional elites. Spain reformed labor laws, reined in public spending, and ultimately stabilized, but scars remained, especially among the younger generation. 5. Regionalism, identity, and constitutional challenges. Spain's effort to accommodate regional identities had mixed results. Catalonia and the Basque Country thrived economically and culturally, celebrated their languages and traditions, and secured wide self-rule. Yet, periodic pushes for greater autonomy or outright independence brought new conflict. The most dramatic moment came in 2017, when the Catalan regional government organized an independence referendum deemed illegal by Spain's constitutional court. The subsequent declaration of independence, Madrid's imposition of direct rule, and legal cases against Catalan leaders triggered the most profound constitutional crisis since the return of democracy. While outright separatist violence largely faded, especially after ETA's 2011 dissolution, negotiating the balance between unity and diversity remains unresolved. A nation of diversity and creativity, modern Spain is among the most decentralized states in Europe and the most progressive on many social issues. Same-sex marriage was legalized in 2005, and Spain is noted for its gender equality policies, international humanitarian work, and active role in environmental initiatives. Its universities, literature, film, gastronomy, and sports, especially football, enjoy global prestige. Migration and globalization have made Spain more diverse than ever, with an increasing number of Latin American, Moroccan, Sub-Saharan, Chinese, and Eastern European communities contributing to the social fabric, sometimes amid tension, but most often with enriching results. 7. Memory, legacy, and the struggle over history. The wounds of the Civil War and Francoism long haunted public life. The 2007 historical memory law sought to recognize victims, remove Francoist symbols, and open mass graves. But debates over Spain's past are still contentious, especially as the far-right Vox Party and other populist groups have grown. Museums, films, and literature grapple with Spain's imperial, colonial, and civil strife legacies, illuminating both tragedy and resilience. The generation of '98 and subsequent waves of artists, poets, filmmakers, and scholars continue to ask, what is Spain? Whose Spain? Daguerre 8. Spain in the 21st century. Spain today is a democracy with a robust civil society, a founding EU member, and a recognized leader in culture, tourism, and renewable energy. Yet it faces persistent challenges: unemployment, the balance between regional autonomy and national union, political fragmentation, and the integration of newcomers. Events such as the COVID-19 pandemic, economic shocks, rapid technological change, and global shifts have continued to test Spain's adaptability and unity. But the nation has repeatedly demonstrated a capacity for reinvention, buoyed by its tradition of resilience, creativity, and shared identity. The story of Spain stretches from the cave paintings of Altamira to global empire, from tragedy and glory to recovery and reconstruction. It is a story of contradictions of diversity and unity, tradition and renewal, pride and introspection. As Spain moves deeper into the 21st century, it shapes and is shaped by a world that is itself constantly in flux, inviting both Spanish citizens and all people to reflect on what it means to belong, transform, and endure.